The twilight of a dynasty begins not with a single event, but with a feeling, an uneasy shift in the air, a growing silence where once there was the clatter of swords, the echo of authority, and the certainty of divine right. As night settles over early medieval Europe, we open on a kingdom caught between the last traces of myth and the first documented rhythms of history. The Merovingians, a line of kings once seen as semi-divine, sacred, untouchable, are fading quietly from the stage. Their story is not merely the record of political change. It is a slow eclipse, a dimming star whose glow still shapes legends today. Imagine a candle burning at both ends, brilliant at first, wild in its flame, and then gradually devoured by its own brilliance. That is the arc of the Merovingians. Their dynasty begins with a legend, an impossible birth from the sea, a child touched by something otherworldly, and ends with a shorn head in a monastery, a king stripped of sacred hair and therefore stripped of power. But between those points lies a labyrinth of secrets, betrayals, relics, political rivalries, and whispers of a bloodline that perhaps never truly vanished. As our story begins, picture the landscape of the early Middle Ages. Dark forests stretching to the horizon, tribes locked in conflict, bishops carrying crosses into battlefields, and kings who were believed to hold magic in their very veins. These were the Merovingians, the long-haired kings, ruling not just by might, but by a mysterious aura that set them apart from all others. Their hair was said to carry their power. Their blood was rumored to be sacred. Chroniclers wrote of them with a mixture of reverence and fear, suggesting that a challenge of Merovingian was not merely treason, but sacrilege. Yet, as centuries passed, something strange happened. Their power began to slip away, not all at once, but subtly, like sand between the fingers. Historians would later call it the transition of authority, a shift from one house to another. But for those witnessing it firsthand, it must have felt like an unraveling, a purposeful dimming of a dynasty that had once been the heartbeat of the Frankish world. Kings were reduced to figureheads, their signatures meaningless, their decisions reversed by ambitious advisors. And in the background, a new family, the Carolingians, waited patiently, watching the twilight deepen. But this documentary is not merely about political succession. It is about the veil of mystery that has always surrounded the Merovingians, a veil thickened by centuries of alternative histories, secret societies, and esoteric interpretations. Some see the Merovingians not as mere kings, but as keepers of ancient knowledge, guardians of relics, even possible descendants of sacred bloodlines that predate Christianity itself. The deeper one goes into the archives of rumor, monastic records, and suppressed chronicles, the more tangled the web becomes. It is tempting to dismiss these theories as romantic inventions, yet they persist because of what history left unexplained. Why were the Merovingians portrayed with such supernatural qualities? Why were their symbols later adopted by groups claiming links to hidden wisdom? Why do certain genealogies vanish at critical points? And why, centuries after their supposed extinction, do their names resurface in stories tied to the Holy Grail, the Knights Templar, and the mysteries of southern France? As the camera metaphorically drifts through the dimly lit halls of forgotten monasteries and over the ruins of ancient Frankish courts, you can almost hear the faint echoes of this lost dynasty. Their rise was meteoric, their influence immense, and their downfall clouded by ambiguity. Even now, scholars debate which parts of their story were documented fact, which were medieval propaganda, and which were intentionally buried. The twilight of the Merovingians is not a simple ending. It is a convergence of forces, political ambition, ecclesiastical strategy, myth-making, and perhaps something more elusive. Their fall marks not just the collapse of a royal house, but a shift in the spiritual and symbolic power structure of Europe. It is the moment when kingship ceased to be mystical and began to be controlled, defined, and reshaped by institutions hungry for dominance. As this first section unfolds, we set the tone for the journey ahead. You will be guided through dense forests of forgotten chronicles, illuminated corridors of alternative history, and quiet corners where suppressed records may still whisper their truths. We begin at dusk, with a dynasty whose light is fading, but whose legacy casts long shadows across centuries. In the chapters that follow, we will explore how a line of kings emerged from legend, ascended to unimaginable power, and then dissolved into obscurity, only to reappear in the strangest corners of European mythology. We will walk the boundary between accepted history and the tantalizing unknown, unraveling the secrets behind the fall of a royal line that perhaps never truly ended. In the earliest mists of European memory, long before the neat borders of nations, before cathedrals rose from stone, before kings sat on thrones carved with Christian symbols, there lived a people who believed their rulers were touched by forces older than time. The world of the early Franks was not simply a landscape of warriors and chieftains. It was a place where myth and life existed side by side, where rivers had spirits, forests held mysteries, and bloodlines were traced not only through parents, but through the realm of gods and creatures half glimpsed in dreams. From this twilight world emerged the origin story of the Merovingians, a dynasty so intertwined with legend that even modern historians find it difficult to separate truth from the echoes of ancient imagination. At the heart of their origin lies the tale of Merovec, the figure from whom the dynasty takes its name. The chronicles do not present him like a typical tribal leader. Instead, they wrap his birth in imagery reminiscent of mythic epics. According to one of the most enduring legends, Merovec's mother encountered a creature in the sea, a being described as half-man, half-bull, known later as the Quinator. The story suggests an encounter not born of fear, but of destiny, as if the sea itself conferred a blessing or a curse upon the Frankish people. When Merovec was born, rumors spread that his father might not be purely human, whether taken literally or symbolically. This tale set the stage for a line of kings believed to possess extraordinary qualities. This myth is more than a strange footnote. It conveys how ancient societies understood leadership. Kingship was not merely political, it was mystical. To rule, one needed a link to the supernatural, something that transcended ordinary life. The story of Merovec fits into a broader pattern found across Indo-European traditions, where founders of royal lines often emerge from unions between humans and divine or mysterious beings. Whether Merovec's tale was an invention of later monks, an oral tradition carried by bards, or a coded story hiding political symbolism, it shaped the identity of the dynasty that followed. In this world, physical traits carried meaning. Among the Merovingians, none was as symbolic as their long hair. Unlike other warriors who might cut their hair for practicality, Merovingian kings wore theirs long as a visible sign of authority. The hair was more than ornament. It was believed to carry their life force, an outward manifestation of their sacred lineage. Chroniclers wrote that cutting a Merovingian king's hair would strip him of his right to rule. In an age where symbols mattered more than documents, this belief acted as both protection and vulnerability. Anyone who touched the royal hair with malicious intent was committing a spiritual attack, not merely a personal insult. This tradition connected the Merovingians to ancient Germanic and Celtic beliefs, where chieftains were seen as mediators between the physical world and the realms of spirits. The long-haired king was not simply a ruler. He was a living conduit of ancestral power. When these kings stood before their warriors, their flowing hair would catch the light of the sun or fire, emphasizing their larger-than-life presence. Even today, one can picture those early courts, tents pitched beside rivers, carved wooden totems placed at gathering sites, warriors swearing loyalty by firelight while their king, with uncut hair, embodied the soul of the tribe. But alongside the myth, there was a harsher reality. Europe in the 5th century was a fractured landscape. The Roman Empire had collapsed in the West, leaving behind scattered pockets of influence and abandoned fortresses overtaken by vines. Into this vacuum stepped the Franks, a federation of tribes searching for unity. The Merovingians emerged as the family capable of forging that unity, not only through war, but through the power of shared belief. Their semi-divine origin made them more than political leaders. It made them symbols of continuity in a time when the world seemed to be unraveling. Yet mainstream historians often caution against taking the legends literally. They point out how medieval chroniclers had a habit of embellishing stories to legitimize power. According to this view, the Quinator myth might have been created to strengthen Merovingian claims or to give them an aura rivaling Roman imperial lore. Others argue that the story may encode older pagan myths, repurposed into the genealogy of a rising dynasty. After all, when newly Christian rulers sought to unite their people, they often blended old beliefs with new convictions to create a smooth transition. Still, the question remains, why this myth and why so elaborate? Why did the chroniclers choose a sea creature for the lineage's origin instead of a more conventional ancestor? Perhaps the answer lies in the symbolic role of water in ancient European spirituality. Water was a boundary between worlds, between the known and unknown, between the living and the divine. A king born from such a realm would belong to both sides, capable of guiding his people through times of upheaval. The legend of Merovingian also foreshadows an important theme in the dynasty's later history: the blending of sacred legitimacy with political necessity. Even as the Merovingians expanded their territories and built alliances, they cultivated an aura that set them apart. Their enemies were not simply fighting a king. They were challenging a lineage that carried supernatural authority. Whether or not their bloodline truly had mystical origins mattered less than the belief itself. In an age defined by symbols, belief was power. As we move deeper into the Merovingian story, we must keep this interplay between myth and reality in mind. The dynasty's rise cannot be understood purely through military conquests or political strategies. It is rooted in a worldview where the supernatural and historical are woven together like strands of the same tapestry. This merging of realms created an identity strong enough to unify the Franks, and mysterious enough to fascinate scholars and storytellers centuries later. The Merovingian origin myth, with its strange sea creature and enigmatic founder, serves as a doorway into this world. It invites us to consider how people of the early Middle Ages saw themselves, their rulers, and their place in the cosmos. It also sets the stage for the themes that will recur throughout their history: secret power, sacred lineage, and the tension between mythic heritage and political ambition. If this dynasty was born from legend, it is no surprise that its fall would later be surrounded by whispers of conspiracy and hidden agendas. The roots planted in mystery grew into a tree whose branches stretched across centuries of lore. As we follow the rise of the Merovingians from these mythical beginnings toward the historical figure of Clovis, the line between the fantastical and the factual will continue to blur, creating a narrative as haunting as it is compelling. In the turbulent landscape of the 5th century, when the echoes of Rome's collapse still trembled through Gaul and the old world seemed to be dissolving into chaos, a young Frankish leader stepped forward with the force of a storm. His name was Clovis. To later chroniclers, he became the hammer that forged a kingdom, the unifier who pulled scattered tribes into a single identity, the warrior king whose decisions altered the course of European history. But Clovis was more than a military tactician. He was an enigmatic figure standing at the crossroads of pagan tradition and Christian transformation. His life bridges the boundary between myth and documented history, giving shape and momentum to the Merovingian dynasty at its most decisive moment. When Clovis inherited leadership of the Salian Franks around the age of 15, he stepped into a world carved into fragments. Roman authority in the region had evaporated, leaving behind governors without armies, bishops without protectors, and cities vulnerable to any strong hand. Germanic tribes fought one another for dominance, while visions of empire clung to the ruins like ghosts. For the Franks to survive, they needed not just strength but unity, something they had never fully achieved under earlier rulers. And it was here at this juncture that Clovis began his ascent. From the beginning, he stood out. Chroniclers describe him as fierce, charismatic, and unyielding. He possessed what early medieval people valued most in a king: presence. Not just physical power or skill in battle, though he had those in abundance, but a strange magnetism, a sense that destiny clung to him. This aura echoed the older Merovingian tradition of sacral kingship, suggesting that Clovis inherited both the mystical charisma of his lineage and the hard-edged realism of a warrior raised in a world without mercy. His early years as king were marked by decisive, often brutal campaigns. He moved swiftly against rival Frankish leaders, defeating opponents who had previously fractured Frankish unity. He won loyalty through both generosity and fear, rewarding those who joined him and eliminating those who stood in his way. These were not mere tribal skirmishes. They were the opening steps toward building a kingdom that stretched far beyond the imagination of any Frankish chief before him. In those battles, Clovis earned a reputation for courage, cunning, and relentless ambition. But the moment that truly shaped his legacy and the future of Europe came not on a battlefield but in the shadow of faith. During a desperate fight near Tolbiac against the Alemanni, legend tells us that Clovis, still a pagan, called upon the Christian God for help after witnessing his warriors falter. "If you grant me victory," he is said to have vowed, "I will believe in you and be baptized." The Frankish chronicles describe a dramatic turn. The Alemanni king fell, their warriors scattered, and Clovis emerged victorious. Whether the story is embellished or not, its symbolic power is undeniable. This moment became the pivot on which his rule turned. His subsequent conversion to Christianity, under the influence of his wife Clotilde and the Bishop Remigius of Reims, was far more than a spiritual decision. It was a political masterstroke. Most Germanic tribes that had adopted Christianity followed the Arian sect, which mainstream Catholic bishops considered heretical. When Clovis embraced Catholic Christianity, he aligned himself with the powerful Gallo-Roman clergy and the remaining Roman aristocracy. This gave him something no other barbarian king possessed: legitimacy in the eyes of the church. The baptism was a spectacle crafted to shape memory. According to tradition, a miraculous dove brought a vial of holy oil, the sacred ampulla, from heaven itself to anoint him. Though historians debate the origins of this story, the symbolism is profound. It elevated Clovis from warrior king to divinely chosen ruler. It also established a ritual connection between the Merovingians and heaven that would echo for centuries. Later French kings would be anointed with the same holy oil, tying their authority to the moment Clovis knelt in the waters of Reims. For the Merovingians, this merging of mythic ancestry with Christian ritual was a turning point. Their earlier mystique, the long hair, the sacred bloodline, the aura of otherworldly influence, now aligned with the most powerful religious institution in the region. They became not just tribal rulers, but kingly shepherds of a Christian people. Clovis's conversion allowed the dynasty to expand with the blessing of bishops, who saw in him a champion capable of defending their communities in a violent age. Following his baptism, Clovis embarked on campaigns that were both military conquests and ideological missions. He moved against Arian Visigoths, presenting himself as the defender of Catholic orthodoxy. He incorporated Roman administrative structures into his rule, blending Frankish bravery with Roman order. He fostered relationships with the church, allowing clerics to frame him as a protector and even a kind of chosen instrument. With each victory, his authority solidified, and the foundation of the Frankish kingdom became more stable. Yet Clovis also remained a ruler of his age, pragmatic, cunning, and often ruthless. His rise included assassinations, orchestrated betrayals, and political maneuvering. He removed rivals both within and beyond the Frankish tribes, at times luring opponents into supposed alliances only to eliminate them. These acts did not diminish his reputation, they enhanced it. In his world, strength was the measure of rulership, and Clovis demonstrated strength beyond question. But his legacy is not limited to war and politics. Clovis reshaped the identity of the region by merging older pagan traditions with new Christian values. He protected bishops while allowing pagan customs to fade slowly, rather than eradicating them by force. This blend of worlds produced something unique, a Christian kingdom rooted in the memory of sacred ancestry, where divine right did not come solely from Scripture, but from a lineage believed to shimmer with ancient power. His story closes with a kingdom far larger than the one he inherited, stretching from the Rhine to the Loire. When he died, his sons divided his lands according to Frankish custom, but the unity he had created remained a defining force. Under Clovis, the Merovingians had become the central power of Gaul, shaping the destiny of what would later become France. More importantly, Clovis established the blueprint for kingship that his descendants, and eventually the Carolingians, would inherit. His fusion of mythic heritage, Christian legitimacy, and ruthless political skill created a model that endured long after his death. The Merovingian dynasty, now armed with divine sanction, would continue to grow in power and prestige, climbing toward the height of its golden age. Yet even as Clovis laid the foundations of greatness, the seeds of future conflict were already being sown. His alliance with the church brought blessings, but it also invited the clergy deeper into royal affairs. His territorial divisions among heirs paved the way for future fragmentation, and his careful balancing of myth and faith created a legacy that later generations would struggle to interpret or manipulate. Clovis stands as both founder and foreshadower. In his triumphs, we see the rise of a dynasty bathed in sacred symbolism. In his political strategies, we glimpse the tensions that will eventually unravel Merovingian authority. His life marks the moment when the Merovingians stepped fully into history, carrying their ancient mysteries with them into the bright and eventually fading light of power. Throughout the early Middle Ages, power was never just a matter of swords and soldiers. It was something deeper, something tied to symbols, relics, and beliefs that shaped the fabric of society. For the Merovingians, this unseen dimension of authority was not an addition to their rule. It was the foundation. Their legitimacy rested on a unique fusion of sacred ancestry, ritualized customs, and a mysterious belief that their blood contained a spark of something extraordinary. To understand why these kings were revered, feared, and eventually targeted for erasure, we must step into the world of early medieval sacred kingship, where power flowed not only through law but through the very body of the ruler. One of the most defining elements of Merovingian rule was the concept of inborn sanctity. Unlike later kings who would claim divine right through coronation ceremonies or papal approval, the Merovingians were believed to carry their authority within their bloodline. Their power was hereditary in more than a political sense. It was mystical. Chroniclers wrote that a Merovingian king possessed healing abilities, prophetic insight, and a natural connection to the spiritual forces of the land. These descriptions were not unusual in the context of ancient Germanic traditions. Their rulers often embodied the soul of the tribe, serving as living intermediaries between the human world and the unseen. This belief manifested physically in one of their most iconic symbols, the long, uncut hair. The hair of a Merovingian king was more than a stylistic choice. It was a sign of his divine essence. It represented continuity with ancestral spirits, authority granted by supernatural lineage, and the unbroken thread that bound the dynasty to its mythical founder. The idea that cutting a Merovingian king's hair stripped him of power was not a metaphor. It was a cultural truth deeply embedded in Frankish tradition. A hairless king was not merely dishonored, he was spiritually severed. This belief mirrored older Indo-European customs in which the body of the king, especially the hair and head, was considered a vessel of potency. Such ideas can feel distant to the modern world, but in the early Middle Ages, they were very real markers of legitimacy. A king was not crowned. He was born, and if anything interfered with that birthright, it could unravel the entire web of authority. This is why later Carolingian manipulation of Merovingian symbols, especially the shearing of Childeric III, held such enormous significance. Cutting his hair was not just political overthrow. It was ritual disempowerment, a deliberate act intended to sever the bloodline from its divine heritage. Beyond physical symbolism, the Merovingians cultivated a special relationship with relics, objects believed to hold sacred power and to stand as bridges between heaven and earth. Relics were more than devotional artifacts. They were political instruments. A king who possessed them gained spiritual prestige and the aura of divine favor. For the Merovingians, relics reinforced what their lineage already suggested. They were guardians of the sacred. Among these relics, none was more important than the holy oil of Reims, the miraculous chrism said to have descended from heaven in a dove-shaped vial. Later associated with the coronation of Clovis, this relic became a cornerstone of French royal tradition. Although historians debate its origins, the symbolism of its connection to the Merovingians remains powerful. It linked the dynasty to Christian sanctity even as it tied them to earlier pagan beliefs in sacred anointing. In this convergence of traditions, the Merovingians found their most potent ideological weapon. But relics were not simply symbols of piety. They were tools of statecraft. A king with access to holy objects could claim the favor of saints, divine intervention in battle, and moral superiority over rivals. When Dagobert I later accumulated relics and endowed churches with treasures, he was reinforcing his position not only as a ruler, but as a sacred protector of the realm. In a world where the boundaries between the spiritual and the political were blurred, such actions were as decisive as any military conquest. Beyond relics and symbols, a subtler dimension of Merovingian sacred kingship emerges when we examine the way chroniclers describe their rule. Even when discussing mundane governance, scribes often included references to miracles, dreams, and portents. These details are not random flourishes. They reflect the worldview of the time. A king's legitimacy was judged partially by his relationship with the supernatural. Did the land prosper under his rule? Did signs appear in the skies? Did saints support or condemn his actions? For the Merovingians, maintaining a connection with the divine, whether through Christian saints, pre-Christian spirits, or ancestral forces, was essential to sustaining their authority. This mystical framework becomes even more intriguing when we consider alternative theories that emerged centuries later. Researchers interested in esoteric traditions have suggested connections between the Merovingians and much older priest-king lineages from Celtic, Scythian, or even Near Eastern cultures. These theories, though not accepted by mainstream historians, arise from the extraordinary aura surrounding Merovingian kingship. The idea that they might have inherited ancient wisdom, or that they acted as initiates in forgotten religious traditions, resonates with how early medieval society already perceived them. Exceptional, chosen, different. Some alternative narratives go further, proposing links between the Merovingian bloodline and early Christian groups who guarded sacred teachings, or even to the shadowy traditions later associated with the Holy Grail. In these accounts, the Merovingians are cast not merely as political rulers, but as keepers of a secret spiritual lineage, one that carried knowledge or relics that threatened more established powers. While these interpretations remain speculative, they highlight how deeply the dynasty's reputation for sacredness penetrated the historical imagination. A more grounded perspective focuses on how the Merovingians used their sacred identity to maintain unity among diverse tribes. The Franks were not a single people, but a coalition of groups with varying customs and beliefs. The aura of sacred kingship allowed the Merovingians to transcend regional distinctions. A ruler who could embody both pagan tradition and emerging Christian identity could serve as a unifying figure in a fragmented world. This blend of spiritual legitimacy and political pragmatism became one of the dynasty's greatest strengths. Yet with every strength comes vulnerability. Because the Merovingians relied so heavily on the mystical aspects of rulership, their decline was not just political, it was symbolic. When later rivals challenged them, they targeted the roots of their sacred authority rather than simply confronting their armies. The gradual weakening of the Merovingian connection to religious institutions, the rise of mayors of the palace, and the rewriting of their reputation in monastic chronicles were all part of a systematic effort to dismantle their sacred status. By understanding how deeply the Merovingians were intertwined with sacred power, we can better grasp why their fall was more than a dynastic shift. It was a shift in the very nature of European kingship. After them, authority would increasingly depend on coronation rites, alliances with the church, and written law rather than mystical inheritance. The world was moving from myth to doctrine, from ancestral magic to institutional order. The Merovingians stood at the threshold. Their blood, their hair, their relics, their miracles, all formed a worldview that would eventually be swept away by the rising influence of organized church authority and the ambitions of rival noble houses. But in their time, they embodied a rare kind of kingship, one in which the visible and invisible worlds were inseparable and where power flowed through symbols as much as through strategy. Their sacral identity shaped their rise, sustained their greatness, and left behind a legacy that would continue to intrigue centuries of historians, mystics, and storytellers. Even as their dynasty edged toward twilight, the aura of sacred kingship remained the heart of their mystery, an inheritance that could never be fully erased, no matter how many chronicles tried to diminish it. At the height of the Merovingian world, when their kings still carried the glow of sacred legitimacy and their court shimmered with wealth, diplomacy, and ritual, there emerged a ruler who seemed to embody the dynasty's promise with luminous clarity. This was Dagobert I, often remembered as the last truly powerful Merovingian king, a figure whose reign stands as the golden summit before the dynasty began its long descent into twilight. To understand the Merovingians at their zenith, we must step into Dagobert's world, a world of opulent courts, restless nobles, shadowy rivals, and decisions whose consequences would echo through centuries. Dagobert inherited a fragmented realm, yet he approached kingship with an energy and elegance that revived the grandeur of his ancestors. Unlike many early medieval rulers who preferred the company of warriors and tribal leaders, Dagobert built a court that was surprisingly sophisticated. His capital at Neustria became a hub of culture, lawmaking, and diplomacy, where bishops, nobles, ambassadors, and advisors gathered under the same gilded roof. The chroniclers of the time marveled at the wealth that flowed through his halls: silks from the East, gold from the Mediterranean, and intricate jewelry crafted by Frankish artisans. At a glance, Dagobert's court resembled the courts of late Roman patricians more than the rough warrior circles of earlier Frankish kings. He surrounded himself with educated clergy and refined administrators who wrote charters, settled disputes, and maintained the machinery of governance. His laws were respected, his presence commanded awe, and his personality, by all accounts, balanced intelligence with a regal confidence. Visitors from other lands left with the impression that the Merovingian kingdom had matured into a true empire, one capable of rivaling the Byzantine and Visigothic courts. Yet beneath this brilliance lay a world of intrigue that Dagobert could never quite escape. The Merovingians had always ruled in a landscape of competing powers. The nobility, the bishops, the military elite, and the rising families who served as mayors of the palace. Among these was a name that would become increasingly significant in the years to come. Pepin of Landen, a member of the Carolingian clan whose descendants would eventually eclipse the Merovingians. During Dagobert's reign, the tension between royal authority and the quiet ambitions of the Carolingians began to take shape. Pepin of Landen initially served as a loyal advisor, a stabilizing force who helped Dagobert manage the complexities of governance. The two men shared a mutual respect, and Dagobert valued Pepin's skill in maintaining order among the restless nobility. But behind the scenes, Pepin was quietly consolidating his family's influence. He cultivated friendships with bishops, made key alliances within the aristocracy, and ensured that Carolingian loyalty was always positioned close to the levers of power. Dagobert may have sensed this growing influence, but the full consequences would only be realized after his death. The political tension was compounded by the cultural and spiritual weight Dagobert carried. As a Merovingian king, he was still seen as a sacred figure, and his court reflected this dual identity. He engaged in extensive patronage of churches, monasteries, and holy sites. He was said to have had a profound fascination with relics, collecting sacred objects as symbols of divine protection and legitimacy. Chroniques describe him donating golden reliquaries, commissioning elaborate shrines, and supporting ecclesiastical centers that enhanced his reputation as a Christian king. Yet this devotion did not erase the older pagan undertones that still lingered around the Merovingian identity. Dagobert's long hair, his ancestral lineage, and the mystical aura surrounding his kingship continued to connect him to the ancient traditions of sacral rule. In him, the dual heritage of the Merovingians, half rooted in Christian sanctity, half in pre-Christian myth, was more evident than ever. This fusion made his reign unique, a blend of old magic and new faith, of earthly governance and symbolic authority. But even as Dagobert strengthened the kingdom, signs emerged that the Merovingian dynasty was entering a precarious phase. The sheer size of the realm made it difficult to govern without delegating power, which often meant granting significant influence to the mayors of the palace. These officials, originally mere administrators, gradually became the actual managers of daily affairs. Their authority grew quietly but steadily, especially in regions far from the king's direct supervision. The aristocracy, too, was becoming more assertive. As wealth flowed into the realm, noble families amassed lands, soldiers, and political leverage. Powerful lords began to view the Merovingian kings not as untouchable sacred rulers, but as figures whose authority could be negotiated or resisted. Ambition seeped into the cracks of the system, spreading slowly but inevitably. Dagobert saw some of these developments, but could not fully reverse them. His reign was too brief, and the forces at play were too deeply rooted. He attempted reforms, such as strengthening royal justice and maintaining control over the aristocracy, but these measures often relied on cooperation from the very people he sought to restrain. The nobles supported him when it suited their interests and quietly expanded their influence when it did not. Even within his court, shadows grew. Advisors whispered, factions formed, and the balance of power shifted subtly. Dagobert remained at the center of the political web, but the strands were being pulled tighter by hands he did not entirely control. The Carolingians, in particular, learned much during his reign: how power could be exercised indirectly, how alliances could be cultivated in the shadows, and how a dynasty could be weakened over time without open rebellion. Despite these undercurrents, Dagobert's rule left a lasting impression. He represented the last moment when a Merovingian king stood with true authority, commanding both reverence and fear. The prosperity of his reign would soon be remembered with nostalgia, contrasted sharply with the decline that followed. The chroniclers who later wrote of the do-nothing kings did so with the memory of Dagobert's grandeur in mind, highlighting the contrast between his sunlit court and the dimmer years that came afterward. Dagobert I's era was, in many ways, the hinge of the dynasty. It was the peak from which the descent began, not suddenly, but with the slow, steady erosion of power from within. His reign shines as the golden hour in the Merovingian story, radiant, complex, and filled with both hope and hidden dangers. The dynasty seemed unassailable under him, yet the seeds of its eventual fall were already being planted in the fertile soil of his achievements. As the last glow of his reign faded, the Merovingians stepped into a world where their sacred aura no longer guaranteed obedience, and where the ambitions of others grew bolder with every passing year. The twilight had not yet fallen, but the long shadows of decline were already stretching across the horizon. In the years that followed Dagobert's passing, the Merovingian world entered a strange, suspended state, a realm neither fully in decline nor truly thriving, but gradually drifting toward a new equilibrium that quietly undermined the authority of the crown. It was during this delicate transition that a single institution rose with unexpected force, shaping the political landscape in ways no one at the time could fully predict: the office of the mayor of the palace. Originally intended as a practical administrative role, a steward who managed the household affairs of the king, this position evolved into something far more potent. By the mid-7th century, the mayor of the palace had become the unseen engine of power within the Frankish kingdoms, a silent force directing, influencing, restraining, and at times outright dominating the Merovingian monarchs. The change began subtly. When a young or inexperienced king took the throne, the nobles of the realm expected someone competent to manage matters of state. The mayors, already entrusted with the logistics of governance, naturally stepped into the vacuum. They issued orders on the king's behalf, negotiated with nobles, and oversaw tax collection and military organization. With each administrative decision, their authority deepened. And because these mayors came from powerful aristocratic families, particularly the rising Carolingians, their influence carried both legitimacy and danger. At first, the Merovingian kings tolerated this shift. It was easier to allow someone else to handle the daily grind of ruling while the monarch maintained his sacred aura and ceremonial role. But this quiet reliance created a subtle dependency. A king whose authority comes from divine lineage may appear unshakable in ritual and appearance. Yet without firm political power beneath him, his throne becomes more symbolic than real. The young Merovingian successors who followed Dagobert inherited kingdoms filled with restless nobles, expanding local power structures, and ambitious mayors who understood the mechanisms of governance better than the kings themselves. These developments were especially visible in the partition structure of the Frankish realm. Neustria, Austrasia, and Burgundy each had their own political rhythms. When a king ruled over multiple regions, he often appointed a mayor in each to ensure stability. This decentralization created fertile ground for local power to grow independent of the crown. The Austrasian mayors, in particular, came to wield extraordinary influence because of the region's strong warrior culture and its noble families that controlled vast estates. It was here that the Carolingian family entrenched itself most successfully. One of the most significant figures of this era was Grimoald, son of Pepin of Landen. While Pepin had been a trusted counselor to Dagobert, Grimoald operated in a world where Merovingian authority was already weakened. Grimoald saw opportunities where others saw tradition, and he recognized that the sacred symbolism of Merovingian kingship was no longer enough to command obedience. Power, real power, lay in the ability to influence the nobles, command the armies, and manage the kingdom's wealth. He assumed these responsibilities with increasing boldness, and the court of Austrasia began to revolve more around the mayor than around the king. The chroniclers from this period speak of Merovingian kings who were little more than figureheads, men who ruled in name but not in deed, sitting on ornate thrones while their decisions were quietly corrected or overridden by the mayors. In some cases, royal decrees were written for the king, who simply affixed a signature or seal without fully comprehending the policy. Envoys would meet the king only briefly, then spend long hours negotiating the real details of diplomacy with the mayor. It was a gradual hollowing out of power, performed softly enough that no single moment appears as the point of collapse. But cumulatively, the shift was profound. The nobles, too, recognized this new order and adapted to it. They sought alliances not with the king, but with the mayor. Marriage alliances, land grants, military support, all flowed through the mayoral office. The mayors became the arbiters of disputes, the distributors of favor, and the protectors of noble interests. In turn, the nobles offered loyalty to the mayor more readily than to the king, for the mayor was the one who truly held their fortunes in hand. The throne was respected, certainly, but increasingly as a relic, an ancient symbol of unity and divine heritage rather than a functioning center of power. And yet, despite the erosion of royal authority, the Merovingian kings were still indispensable. Their lineage carried the mystique of sacred legitimacy, something the mayors, pragmatic and worldly as they were, could not replicate. This created a paradox at the heart of Frankish politics. The kings were essential but powerless, while the mayors were powerful but technically subordinate. This tension would define the political theater of the age. The sacred kings performed the rituals, blessings, processions, appearances, while the mayors directed armies, administered justice, and negotiated treaties. All the while, the Carolingian family was sharpening its influence. Their strategy was patient, meticulous, and rooted in long-term thinking. They did not seek to dethrone the Merovingians outright. Instead, they expanded their authority gradually, ensuring that when the time came, the transition of power would appear almost natural. Through strategic marriages, patronage networks, and the accumulation of land, they built a foundation that would eventually allow them to eclipse their royal counterparts. But the Merovingians were not entirely unaware of what was happening. Some kings attempted reforms to reclaim authority, though these efforts were often inconsistent or resisted by the nobles. Others, especially those raised from childhood under the supervision of mayors, lacked the political experience or support necessary to challenge the new order. Their sacred lineage still commanded respect, but reverence alone could not restore the power that had slipped through their fingers. Over time, the image of the king became increasingly ceremonial. The long hair that had once symbolized divine rule became a relic clinging to an identity that few actively defended. Palaces that once bustled with lively councils grew quieter as decisions were made elsewhere. Even the royal treasury fell under the influence of the mayors, who controlled its use and distribution with a confidence bordering on ownership. The rise of the mayors was not merely a political transformation. It was a profound cultural shift. It redefined where authority truly resided in the Frankish realm and set the stage for a dramatic reordering of power that would soon reshape Western Europe. What began as a practical administrative adaptation had, by this era, evolved into a shadow government, efficient, influential, and increasingly indispensable. The Merovingian line remained the face of the kingdom, but behind that face lived a new architecture of power, one that no sacred lineage could easily overcome. As the decades unfolded, the tension between symbolic royalty and practical governance grew sharper. The Merovingian throne still glowed with the light of ancient tradition, but beneath that glow was the faint, almost imperceptible flicker of instability, the early tremor of a dynasty entering its twilight, unaware that its greatest threat was not rebellion or war, but the silent rise of those who served it. As the Merovingian kings drifted deeper into ceremonial stillness, another force quietly reshaped the very soul of the Frankish world, a force older than the kings themselves, yet newly empowered in their time. The Church, once a modest spiritual companion to the ruling class, evolved into an institution woven into every thread of political life. Its bishops, abbots, and monastic scholars did not replace kings or nobles outright. Instead, they influenced them, guided them, and sometimes manipulated them in ways that subtly determined the fate of the dynasty. This was the era when spiritual authority blended seamlessly with political ambition, creating a landscape where the sacred and the worldly merged into a single, complex tapestry. The early Merovingians had understood the symbolic power of aligning with Christianity, but by the 7th century, the Church was no longer an auxiliary voice. It was a pillar of the state. Monasteries grew in number and influence, becoming centers of learning, wealth, and landholding. Bishops served not only as spiritual leaders, but as administrators, diplomats, and advisors whose decisions shaped regional politics. Their letters, chronicles, and decrees preserved the memory of kings, judged their actions, and defined which rulers were remembered as noble and which were forgotten or condemned. This power over narrative was not merely cultural, it was political leverage. What made the Church so effective was its permanence. Kings lived and died, nobles rose and fell, but the Church remained. Its continuity gave it a unique vantage point. It could nurture long-term alliances, observe shifting power dynamics, and adjust its strategies across generations. Bishops often came from noble families themselves, blending aristocratic ambition with ecclesiastical authority. Their influence reached into every corner of the realm, from the royal court to remote villages where the king's name was known only through prayers spoken by priests at Massachusetts. In this period, the relationship between the Church and the Merovingian state deepened in ways that made sacred politics indistinguishable from royal governance. The kings relied on the clergy to legitimize their authority through rituals, coronations, and blessings. In turn, the Church relied on the kings for protection, patronage, and land grants that expanded its power. This mutual dependency created a fragile balance, one that could tip in favor of the Church whenever a king was weak, young, or politically isolated. After Dagobert's death, this imbalance became even more pronounced. His successors, often minors or inexperienced rulers, depended heavily on bishops and abbots for guidance. The clergy used this opportunity to strengthen their influence over royal decisions, sometimes in the name of moral reform, sometimes in pursuit of their own political interests. Their counsel often overshadowed that of the royal household, blurring the lines between divine advice and strategic manipulation. This was also the era when the Church sharpened its mastery over legitimacy. A king who displeased the clergy could find himself subtly undermined, his decrees challenged, his alliances questioned, his reputation tarnished by chroniclers who framed him as sinful or incompetent. Conversely, rulers who aligned themselves with ecclesiastical priorities were celebrated as divinely favored. The Church did not wield armies in the traditional sense, but its control over ideology and morality became a weapon that could elevate or destroy a ruler with surprising efficiency. Meanwhile, the monasteries became sanctuaries of both spirituality and political influence. Abbeys like St. Denis, Luxeuil, and Columbanus's foundations across Gaul and beyond played dual roles, preserving ancient texts and forming networks of educated men who often went on to serve as advisors to the kings or the mayors of the palace. These monastic communities maintained vast estates, controlled agricultural wealth, and served as hubs for diplomacy. Their abbots answered only to higher ecclesiastical authority, which further insulated them from royal oversight. It would be a mistake to portray this expanding clerical authority as purely self-serving. Many bishops genuinely sought to correct abuses and corruption and promote moral order in a kingdom riddled with factional rivalry. Some attempted to mediate disputes between nobles, prevent civil wars, and maintain stability when royal leadership faltered. Their presence offered continuity in a political environment increasingly dominated by the ambitions of the aristocracy and the rising influence of the mayors. In many ways, the church acted as the glue holding together a realm slowly fracturing from within. However, the church also formed a peculiar alliance with the very forces that would one day end Merovingian rule. The Carolingian family cultivated close ties with key bishops, presenting themselves as defenders of Christian order and sponsors of monastic reform. This positioned them as moral counterparts to the weakening Merovingian kings. While the Merovingians retained sacred lineage, the Carolingians offered something more practical to the church: structure, discipline, and consistent support for ecclesiastical expansion. Clergy across Frankish territories observed with interest the contrast between symbolic Merovingian majesty and the active governance of the Carolingians. This observation gradually shaped a new narrative, one that would eventually redefine kingship itself. The idea emerged, subtle at first, but growing stronger, that true kingship required not just ancient blood, but effective stewardship aligned with divine will. In the Chronicles, this was sometimes expressed as God favoring the just over the corrupt, the capable over the idle. Such phrasing, ambiguous but powerful, laid the groundwork for the ideological transition that awaited the dynasty. The Merovingian kings still performed their sacred rituals, but the church was increasingly the interpreter of what those rituals meant. Bishops determined which kings were considered righteous, which controversies were framed as divine warnings, and which political actions were presented as maintaining or violating God's order. Through sermons and sacred texts, they could cast judgment without ever raising a sword. All the while, the church accumulated wealth and land at a pace unmatched by any noble family. Donations, tithes, and royal gifts enriched monasteries and dioceses, enabling them to build new churches, restore old sanctuaries, and commission works of art that reflected the prosperity of the age. This wealth brought political capital. A bishop who controlled vast estates wielded influence over the peasants who worked those lands, the nobles who sought church favor, and the kings who relied on ecclesiastical networks for administrative stability. By the time this era matured, the Merovingians were no longer the sole keepers of sacred authority. The church had become a co-guardian, a partner whose influence ran deep into the marrow of the kingdom. And in some ways, the church saw itself as the protector of the Frankish realm beyond any single dynasty. If a king failed in his duty, the church could subtly withdraw its spiritual support, creating a moral vacuum that another family might step in to fill. The Merovingians still wore the crown, still bore the long hair of their divine heritage, but the world around them had changed. The church no longer stood beside the throne. It stood behind it, above it, and around it, an invisible spine supporting the body of the kingdom even as the royal heart grew weaker. In this shifting landscape, the forces that would eventually bring about the twilight of the Merovingians were gathering, quietly and confidently, preparing for the moment when sacred lineage alone would no longer be enough to hold a dynasty together. The deeper the Merovingian world drifted into the 7th century, the more it became defined not by unity, but by fragmentation. The Frankish realm, sprawling and diverse, had always been divided into major subkingdoms, Neustria, Austrasia, and Burgundy. But during this era, these divisions hardened into something closer to separate political universes. The kings still claimed authority over all Frankish lands, yet their power was increasingly theoretical. What truly shaped the destiny of the dynasty were the regional factions, clusters of nobles, bishops, and military leaders, whose alliances and rivalries quietly restructured the very architecture of power. These factions were not simply political groups. They were parallel kingdoms operating beneath the surface of the official realm. Each region developed its own personality, ambitions, and power networks. Neustria, with its wealth and proximity to older Roman centers, clung to traditions of royal prestige. Austrasia, with its vast frontier lands and powerful warlords, became the crucible of rising aristocratic influence. Burgundy, though often overshadowed by the other two, nurtured its own blend of spiritual authority and noble independence. In theory, the king linked these territories. In practice, the regional factions tied the kingdom into knots. The roots of these divisions stretched back decades, but in the wake of Dagobert's reign, they deepened sharply. When a young or weak king took the throne, nobles in each territory acted to shield their own interests. Their alliances crossed the boundaries of loyalty, blending personal ambition with regional identity. Local power became the true currency of influence, and the king, increasingly distant, appeared more like a ceremonial figure presiding over a realm he could no longer shape. In Neustria, the aristocracy formed a powerful bloc that prized courtly influence and access to royal favor. They cultivated close ties with bishops, orchestrated marriages, and used their proximity to the king as leverage against rivals in other regions. Neustrian nobles saw themselves as the natural guardians of Merovingian heritage, defenders of the idea that the kingdom's center was the royal household. This belief fueled their resistance against the growing strength of Austrasian elites, whom they viewed as overly ambitious and insufficiently reverent toward Merovingian sacred traditions. Austrasia, by contrast, was the powerhouse of raw military strength. Its nobles commanded large warrior retinues, controlled expansive estates, and possessed intense regional solidarity. They were less impressed by ceremonial power and more attuned to practical governance. It was in Austrasia that the mayors of the palace first rose to commanding influence, and it was here that the Carolingians built their foundations. The Austrasian faction viewed the weakening of Merovingian authority not with concern, but with opportunity, the chance to fill the void with disciplined leadership rooted in martial strength and regional unity. Their vision of the future did not revolve around sacred lineage. It revolved around effective rule. Burgundy, though often quieter, played a crucial balancing role. Its nobles maintained strong ties to monastic communities, and its bishops were among the most influential in shaping ecclesiastical policy. Burgundian elites saw themselves as mediators, arbiters between the culturally Romanized West and the warrior-dominated East. Yet their desire for stability pushed them to align with whichever faction promised the most predictable governance. This made them a swing force in the shifting political tides. As these regions drifted apart, the court became a battlefield of influence where factions maneuvered behind the scenes. Rivalries emerged not only between regions, but within them. Noble houses competed for land, military power, and ecclesiastical patronage. Ambitious families forged alliances across territories, creating webs of loyalty that bypassed the king entirely. Bishops supported one faction while abbots supported another, turning monasteries into quiet centers of political strategy. Meanwhile, the kings themselves often became pawns in the hands of nobles. When a monarch was too young to rule, factions fought to control the regency. When a king reached adulthood, factions competed to dominate his advisors. Even the selection of the royal household staff became a contest between regional interests. In many cases, faction leaders treated the king as a symbolic asset, a legitimizing figure whose sacred aura could be invoked to justify their own authority. This environment created a paradoxical stage where the king was constantly present yet increasingly irrelevant. His authority existed in ritual and tradition, but decision-making flowed through factional networks. A royal decree might be drafted in Neustria, approved by nobles in Burgundy, and resisted in Austrasia. A marriage alliance meant to unite regions often ignited new tensions instead. Political unity became harder to maintain, and the Merovingian world began to resemble a collection of semi-independent realms loosely held together by shared memory rather than shared governance. The Carolingians, masters of regional strategy, thrived in this environment. They cultivated alliances with Austrasian nobles, strengthened ties with the church, and positioned themselves as champions of stability in a fractured realm. Their reputation grew steadily, not because they sought to undermine the kings, but because the kings failed to assert themselves. Every factional dispute, every local rebellion, every noble uprising created a vacuum that the Carolingians filled with quiet competence. Chroniclers from this era recorded these conflicts with a mixture of concern and fascination. They described councils where nobles shouted over each other, courts where bishops argued about regional privileges, and assemblies where the kings sat silently while others debated the future of the realm. Their accounts reveal a kingdom slowly losing coherence, one where sacred kingship could no longer impose unity, and where regional identity had become the dominant force shaping political reality. The fragmentation did not lead to immediate collapse. Instead, it created a slow tension that stretched across generations, a gradual unraveling that weakened the dynasty without dramatic rebellion or invasion. The groups pulling at the fabric of the realm did not wish to destroy the Merovingians. They simply wished to control the space around them. Yet in their attempts to secure advantage, they unwittingly chipped away at the central pillar of authority. It was this era of factionalism that marked a turning point in the dynasty's fate. The Merovingians were no longer the unquestioned rulers of a unified kingdom. They were the symbolic heads of a fracturing realm where power lived in the shadows of regional ambition. The seeds of their decline were not sown by enemies at the borders, but by allies within the heart of their own kingdom. Without a strong, central authority to bind the regions together, the Merovingians drifted into a world where their sacred lineage could no longer compensate for the growing cracks beneath their feet, a world where the twilight of their dynasty became not only possible, but inevitable. As the Merovingian dynasty slipped further into political ambiguity, their identity, once rooted in sacred authority and ancient prestige, began to erode under the weight of a changing world. Yet, strangely, the weakening of their political power did not erase the aura that surrounded them. If anything, their mysterious heritage grew more pronounced as their grip on governance slipped away. This contradiction gave birth to a complex, almost mythic narrative surrounding the royal bloodline, a narrative of sacred lineage, supernatural symbolism, and whispered secrets that lingered long after their authority began fading from the halls of power. For centuries, the Merovingians had cultivated an image unlike any other royal house in Europe. Their kings were said to possess divine origins, descendants, according to legend, of a mysterious sea creature known as the Quinator, whose union with a Frankish queen supposedly produced the line's mythical ancestor, Merovic. Whether this tale was taken literally or symbolically, it strengthened the belief that the dynasty carried a spark of something otherworldly within their blood. Even in an age increasingly defined by Christian orthodoxy, this pagan-seeming myth never fully disappeared. It clung to the dynasty like a shadow, a reminder that their roots reached into something older and stranger than the courts of their time. Such legends were not merely tales told for entertainment. They influenced how the people perceived their rulers. The Merovingian kings were believed to possess supernatural qualities, heightened intuition, prophetic dreams, and a peculiar sensitivity to the spiritual world. Their long, uncut hair, one of their most distinctive features, became a physical symbol of their divine heritage. Chroniclers insisted that a Merovingian king's power resided in his hair to such an extent that cutting it was equivalent to stripping him of his sacred right to rule. This made the hair not just a fashion choice, but a living emblem of authority, woven into the identity of the dynasty itself. This mystique remained a powerful cultural anchor, even as real political power shifted to the mayors of the palace. The nobles might negotiate with mayors, and the church might guide kings, but the people still whispered that only a Merovingian could truly embody the sacred essence of kingship. It was as though the dynasty ruled in two worlds, one political and increasingly fragile, the other symbolic and enduring. The latter became especially important during an era when the kingdom's political structure was fracturing. In times of uncertainty, people turned to symbols, and the Merovingians embodied a lineage that predated any noble faction or ecclesiastical decree. But as the dynasty weakened, the symbolic power became a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it preserved their significance even when their authority faltered. On the other, it trapped them within an identity that no longer matched political reality. The kings were revered as sacred figures, yet treated as ceremonial tokens by the very nobles who invoked their lineage for legitimacy. This paradox created a strange tension at court. Everyone respected the myth, yet few obeyed the monarch. The church, which had long supported the idea of sacred kingship, began subtly redefining the concept. While they recognized the Merovingians' traditional role as divinely appointed rulers, they increasingly emphasized moral qualities over inherited sanctity. A king's bloodline might grant him the right to rule, they argued, but only virtue, justice, and piety could justify that rule. This shift in ideology was quiet but revolutionary. It meant that sacred lineage alone was no longer enough. A dynasty like the Merovingians, dependent on myth more than administration, found itself suddenly judged by criteria that favored more disciplined, morally aligned families like the Carolingians. At the same time, nobles began experimenting with the boundaries of sacred kingship. They manipulated Merovingian identity to suit their political agendas. If they needed legitimacy, they elevated the king's sacred lineage. If they needed freedom to act without royal oversight, they highlighted his weakness or insignificance. This fluid use of royal identity allowed factions to benefit from the dynasty without fully supporting it. The Merovingians became a political tool, invoked when convenient, sidelined when not. As this happened, the myth of the dynasty began to evolve independently of the reality. The kings themselves grew more detached from the qualities that had once defined their greatness. They no longer commanded armies, shaped policy, or mediated disputes. Their royal household shrank, their treasuries dwindled, and their influence became confined to ceremonial roles such as receiving envoys or attending religious festivals. Yet even as their real-world presence diminished, their symbolic identity took on a life of its own. The people continued to associate them with ancient power, divine chosenness, and mystical heritage. It was as though the dynasty had become a relic, venerated, admired, but no longer alive. This increasing gap between myth and reality manifested in unusual ways. Chroniclers began to describe Merovingian kings as slumbering monarchs, present but inactive, blessed but ineffective. Their long hair, once a sign of untouchable authority, became a symbol of neglect. Rituals that once reinforced their power were now performed out of habit rather than reverence. The sacred aura remained, but it no longer commanded the kingdom's direction. In the countryside, however, the myths persisted with surprising vitality. Villagers spoke of Merovingian kings as having healing powers, or as being chosen by God for reasons beyond human politics. Some stories attributed miracles to them. Others spoke of curses that would befall anyone who harmed one of their bloodline. These legends added a layer of mysticism that insulated the dynasty from complete irrelevance. Even powerful nobles hesitated to eliminate the Merovingians entirely, fearing spiritual consequences or public backlash. Ironically, it was this lingering aura that prevented the Carolingians from acting too boldly too soon. They understood that the dynasty's symbolism was deeply rooted in the collective consciousness of the kingdom. To overthrow such a lineage outright would risk backlash not only from nobles, but from the church and the common people. Instead, the Carolingians positioned themselves as protectors of Merovingian tradition, stewards of a decaying sacred order. They presented their rising influence not as rebellion, but as restoration, an attempt to preserve the sacred monarchy from its own weaknesses. This facade worked because the identity of the Merovingians, though fading, still carried weight. People believed in their sacred origin story. They believed in the power of their hair, their connection to ancient gods, their divine right to rule. Even as their kingdoms fragmented and their authority dwindled, their myth lived on with surprising resilience. It created the illusion that the dynasty still mattered, even when the throne they sat upon had turned to dust beneath them. In this era, identity became both the Merovingians' greatest strength and their most profound weakness. Their mythic aura preserved their relevance, yet it also prevented them from adapting to the political realities of the time. They clung to their sacred heritage as the world around them shifted to new forms of power, discipline, and governance. And while the people still admired the dynasty's mysterious origins, admiration alone could not restore the authority that had slowly slipped into the hands of others. As the Merovingian dynasty moved steadily toward its final decline, the tensions that had been quietly accumulating for generations began to surface with unmistakable clarity. What had once been a stable, if symbolically oriented kingship was now unraveling into a complex struggle over legitimacy, authority, and the very meaning of rulership in the Frankish world. The empire they had forged through conquest, diplomacy, and sacred prestige was no longer held together by the strength of royal command, but by the fragile bonds of custom and memory. In this environment, every misstep, every moment of indecision, and every sign of weakness contributed to the sense that the age of Merovingian dominance was drawing to a natural close. The disintegration became most visible in the breakdown of administrative unity. The kingdom, already divided among heirs in earlier generations, now fractured into semi-independent territories controlled by powerful nobles and local magnates. These regional leaders developed their own interests, their own alliances, and even their own military forces. While they continued to acknowledge the Merovingian king in name, their loyalty was suspended between tradition and ambition. When conflicts arose, whether disputes over land, succession, or political influence, these nobles acted according to their personal objectives rather than any overarching sense of Frankish unity. The king's authority, once seen as divinely unquestionable, was increasingly treated as a formality. This decline was further accelerated by the growing inability of the Merovingian rulers to command the loyalty of the army. Military strength had always been a central part of Frankish identity, and previous kings had gained their authority through battlefield success. But by this period, royal control over military forces had weakened dramatically. Commanders were more closely tied to their own lords and estates than to the throne. Without direct access to a loyal and coordinated army, the king could neither enforce his will nor protect the realm from external threats. This military fragmentation made the monarchy appear passive and vulnerable, a shadow of what it had once been during the height of Merovingian expansion. The Carolingian mayors of the palace took advantage of this void with calculated precision. While maintaining the appearance of loyalty to the Merovingian crown, they steadily gathered the political, military, and administrative instruments of power into their own hands. They controlled taxation, managed royal lands, and supervised diplomatic relations. Their authority grew because they offered what the Merovingian kings no longer could: effective leadership, protection, and decisive action. The more the Carolingians demonstrated competence, the more the Frankish world turned toward them as the true stewards of stability. Yet even as the Carolingians rose, they showed careful restraint. They understood that legitimacy was not secured merely by administration or military strength. It also depended on public perception. The Merovingians still possessed a symbolic aura deeply ingrained in the population's imagination. Their divine lineage, sacred hair, and long heritage were not easily dismissed. For many, a world without a Merovingian king was difficult to imagine. This meant the Carolingians could not simply replace them through brute force or immediate dismissal. Instead, they gradually redefined kingship in a way that undermined the very foundations of Merovingian identity. Through the support of the Church, they reframed rulership as something based on virtue, moral responsibility, and active governance, qualities the fading kings no longer embodied. Meanwhile, the Merovingian court became increasingly ceremonial, disconnected from the evolving political landscape. The kings participated in rituals and received ambassadors, but these acts had little effect on real governance. Their isolation grew both physically and politically. Chroniclers describe them as rulers who rarely spoke, rarely traveled, and rarely acted. Their once vibrant courts became echo chambers of tradition, repeating the gestures of power without possessing its substance. Their royal estates shrank, their treasuries emptied, and their influence waned until they existed more as relics of a bygone era than living leaders of a dynamic kingdom. This stagnation bred an atmosphere of resignation. Even those who respected the Merovingian heritage recognized the need for effective leadership in a period marked by internal instability and external threats. The growing danger posed by neighboring powers, including rising Germanic tribes and forces along the eastern frontier, underscored the urgency of strong, centralized authority. Yet that authority no longer radiated from the Merovingian throne. As fear and uncertainty spread, the people began to look elsewhere for protection and guidance. The Church, perhaps the most influential institution of the era, played a crucial role in shaping the final stages of Merovingian decline. Bishops and clerical scholars increasingly aligned themselves with the Carolingians, drawn by their promise of reform, discipline, and religious partnership. They believed the Carolingians could restore order and strengthen the Christian identity of the realm, whereas the Merovingians seemed trapped in the remnants of an older, fading tradition. Through sermons, letters, and counsel, the Church subtly encouraged the idea that God favored those who upheld justice and piety, again reinforcing qualities attributed to the Carolingians rather than the kings they served. All these forces, political ambition, military fragmentation, shifting ideology, and social expectation, converged to create an atmosphere in which the Merovingian end seemed both inevitable and almost natural. The dynasty had once shaped the destiny of the Frankish people, but now it was the people, their leaders, and their institutions shaping the destiny of the dynasty. The kings remained as ceremonial figures, distant echoes of power that no longer resonated with the needs of their time. In this final phase, the Merovingian name still carried weight, but it was the weight of history, not of authority. Their role had transformed from rulers to symbols, from leaders to reminders of a legacy that had outlived its relevance. And as the Carolingians continued to rise with growing confidence, the stage was set for a transition that would fundamentally reshape the political landscape of Western Europe. The age of Merovingian rule was ending, not through dramatic upheaval or violent revolution, but through a gradual shift in power, a quiet but decisive transfer of authority from a fading dynasty to a new one poised to redefine the future. The Merovingians were not merely rulers of men. Many accounts suggest they were guardians of hidden knowledge, participants in ceremonies and practices that blurred the line between the political and the mystical. Across the kingdoms of the early Franks, stories circulated that their reign was infused with more than worldly power, that their authority was reinforced by rituals, secret rites, and esoteric wisdom passed down through generations. These were not idle tales. Some chronicles hint at ceremonies performed deep within forests, on sacred hills, or in the silent sanctuaries of stone-built temples, places shielded from the public eye. There were spaces where the royal line could connect to forces beyond the tangible, channels of influence that the ordinary citizen could neither see nor comprehend. Some historians and esoteric scholars argue that these rituals were designed to harness the supposed sacred blood of the Merovingians. It was said that the king's long hair, flowing and uncut, was more than a fashion or status symbol. Their hair was considered a conduit of power, an outward sign of their divine essence. During rites of passage, coronations, or significant battles, the presence of the sacred hair was central, thought to strengthen their authority and align them with higher cosmic currents. Ancient texts, often veiled in allegory or symbolic language, hint that these ceremonies were precise and deliberate, combining chants, gestures, and the careful use of relics. The effect was more than ceremonial. It was believed to actively influence the fortunes of kingdoms, the outcome of wars, and even the health of the king himself. Royal women, often overlooked in conventional histories, were deeply enmeshed in these esoteric practices. Queens and princesses were not passive observers. They were trained in rituals that ensured the continuity of sacred knowledge. Some accounts describe their involvement in protective rites, divination, and the preservation of mystical secrets that guided political decisions. These women, positioned at the intersection of power and mysticism, could shape the fate of the dynasty without ever stepping onto the battlefield. Their roles, deliberately hidden from chroniclers or minimized in historical accounts, suggest a sophisticated system of influence that operated in the shadows, invisible yet potent. The nature of these esoteric practices remains shrouded in ambiguity, partly because much of the evidence comes from fragmented manuscripts, marginal notes in monastic records, or later occult interpretations. Yet a pattern emerges, a deliberate interweaving of spiritual symbolism with political authority. Kings were not only crowned with crowns, but also with the weight of hidden knowledge. Some historians speculate that these rituals borrowed from older Celtic, Gallo-Roman, or even pre-Christian traditions, integrating sacred geometry, astronomical alignments, and seasonal ceremonies. Certain festivals or sacred days may have marked the performance of rites meant to maintain cosmic harmony, reinforcing the legitimacy of the Merovingian dynasty. There are also intriguing references to objects used in these practices. Chalices, staffs, rings, and even clothing appear in texts as instruments imbued with power. Some suggest these were more than ceremonial. They were repositories of encoded knowledge or talismans designed to channel spiritual energy. A chalice, for example, may have symbolized not only the bloodline, but also a connection to divine or cosmic forces. Royal garments, adorned with symbolic patterns, were worn during key rites, perhaps to amplify or protect the wearer's mystical influence. In some accounts, specific items were hidden away after use, locked in sanctuaries or buried beneath churches to be guarded by a select few. This careful preservation hints at an understanding of knowledge as something sacred and potentially dangerous, meant only for those initiated into the mysteries of the line. Beyond objects and ceremonies, there is evidence to suggest that the Merovingians had a coded language of ritual gestures, hand positions, and even movements that carried specific meanings. While exact interpretations are lost, some scholars compare these to early forms of symbolic communication found in other mystical traditions, suggesting an elaborate system of internal signaling. These gestures may have reinforced the connection between rulers and initiates, signaling divine favor, affirming authority, or invoking protection. To an outsider, these gestures would appear merely ceremonial, but to those within the inner circle, they conveyed layers of esoteric significance. The secrecy surrounding these practices was deliberate. Public acknowledgement could diminish the aura of mystery, leaving the rulers vulnerable to challenges. Thus, the most potent rites were performed away from prying eyes, in the quiet of night, or within secluded sanctuaries. Chroniclers, especially those aligned with the church or rival factions, often dismissed or ignored these ceremonies, leaving gaps in the historical record. This absence only fuels modern fascination. What was truly being preserved? What forces did the Merovingians seek to control or commune with? And, most provocatively, do these rituals contribute to their eventual downfall or disappearance from history? Some esoteric theorists argue that the Merovingians' decline was tied to the suppression of these practices. As the Carolingians rose to power, they may have viewed these rites as dangerous, a threat to centralized authority and the legitimacy of the new dynasty. Monasteries and churches, expanding in influence, could have systematically eradicated the knowledge, burying texts, confiscating sacred objects, and rewriting accounts to erase the mystical dimension of the Merovingians. If true, this deliberate suppression would explain why so many references are cryptic, allegorical, or hidden in obscure manuscripts, fragments of a puzzle that modern scholars and enthusiasts are still trying to piece together. Ultimately, the esoteric practices of the Merovingians, whether fully factual or partly legendary, reveal a dynasty that operated on multiple levels: political, symbolic, and mystical. Their authority was not merely inherited or militarily enforced, but intertwined with a system of sacred knowledge and ritual. Understanding these practices offers a glimpse into a world where kings and queens were not only rulers of territory, but custodians of hidden truths, engaging with forces that stretched beyond the material realm. It is in this intersection of power and mystery that the true allure of the Merovingians resides, a dynasty whose fall cannot be understood solely through armies and alliances, but must be glimpsed through the shadows of sacred rituals, secret symbols, and a knowledge lost to time. The story of the Merovingians' disappearance is one of the most tantalizing enigmas in European history. While the Carolingians rose to prominence, supplanting the old dynasty, whispers persisted of a line that had not truly vanished, of bloodlines that continued in secret, hidden from both the annals of history and the eyes of the church. The sudden decline of a dynasty that had ruled for centuries raises questions that conventional history struggles to answer. Was it purely a matter of politics, or was there something deeper at play, some unseen force guiding their twilight? Political turmoil alone cannot fully explain the Merovingians' fall. Historical records recount assassinations, power grabs, and manipulation at the highest levels, yet there is an unmistakable pattern of disappearance, of erasure. Kings who should have wielded power suddenly fade from the record, their influence diminished almost overnight. Some chroniclers hint at secret edicts, annulments of authority, or legal maneuvers designed to strip the Merovingians of their titles, while leaving their bodies and bloodline largely untouched. But these documents are often ambiguous, as if deliberately written to obscure the truth. This ambiguity has fueled centuries of speculation, suggesting that the fall of the Merovingians was orchestrated on multiple fronts: political, spiritual, and esoteric. The notion of hidden heirs is central to many of these theories. Legend suggests that children of the Merovingian line were spirited away, kept in secrecy, and raised in remote monasteries, noble households, or even foreign courts. Some accounts hint at families entrusted with their protection, sworn to keep the bloodline safe from enemies who would exploit or destroy it. This shadow lineage, if it existed, would have been invisible to official historians, living quietly while the world assumed the line had ended. Over centuries, these descendants may have interwoven with other noble families, leaving faint traces of Merovingian blood scattered across Europe, unrecognized yet persistent. There is also speculation that the dynasty's supposed mystical knowledge played a role in its disappearance. The rituals, sacred artifacts, and esoteric practices that had once reinforced the power of the Merovingians may have made them targets. If their authority was intertwined with forces beyond the material, the threat they posed to rising powers, whether political or ecclesiastical, would have been far greater than that of ordinary kings. Some theories propose that their esoteric secrets were forcibly suppressed, manuscripts destroyed, artifacts seized, and ceremonies forbidden. This would not only diminish their power, but also erase their influence from the historical narrative, leaving behind a carefully curated void that hides their true legacy. The disappearance of physical evidence contributes to the mystery. Palaces fell into ruin, tombs were emptied or destroyed, and artifacts were hidden, buried, or repurposed. Even Dagobert's supposed resting place has become a locus of speculation, its contents unknown or deliberately concealed. Scholars have long debated whether treasures, sacred relics, or encoded documents were seized by successors or secret societies, kept from the public to prevent knowledge from spreading. This deliberate erasure leaves the modern historian with tantalizing fragments, inscriptions, symbols, and marginal notes that suggest a story larger than what is recorded. Some of the most provocative theories suggest that the Merovingians' disappearance was not merely about survival, but about transformation. Their retreat from public view may have been strategic, an intentional withdrawal from the turbulent political stage to preserve something far more enduring than a throne: their knowledge, their bloodline, and their influence over future generations. Hidden monasteries, secret alliances, and covert societies may have served as the vessels of this continuity, ensuring that while the Merovingians vanished from the public eye, their essence persisted. In this light, their fall becomes less a tragedy and more a calculated reinvention, a survival strategy designed to transcend the limitations of conventional power. The mystique of lost documents and cryptic chronicles reinforces the sense of deliberate concealment. References to obscure texts, often dismissed as legend, hint at a wealth of knowledge once possessed by the dynasty. These documents are described as containing genealogical secrets, ritual instructions, and prophetic visions, written in language deliberately coded or allegorical to prevent uninitiated readers from deciphering them. Some theorists suggest that fragments of these manuscripts found their way into later occult traditions, influencing groups from the Rosicrucians to secret Masonic orders. If this is true, the Merovingians' disappearance from the historical record may have been complemented by a quiet continuation of their mystical and political influence in shadowy circles across Europe. Even geography played a role in the line's survival or concealment. Remote regions, dense forests, and secluded river valleys may have served as refuges for hidden heirs or secret ceremonies. Oral traditions from these areas sometimes preserve faint echoes of the Merovingian legacy, from whispered tales of long-haired kings to local rituals that recall sacred practices. Archaeological discoveries, though rare, occasionally hint at structures or artifacts aligned with these legends, suggesting that the dynasty's story may have persisted beyond the reach of mainstream chronicles. The question of the Merovingians' vanishing line ultimately challenges our understanding of history itself. Were they victims of political machinations alone, or was their fall orchestrated by forces that understood and feared the true extent of their influence? Did their secret knowledge make them targets, or did it enable their survival in ways we can scarcely imagine? Each theory, whether grounded in history, legend, or esoteric speculation, underscores a central truth. The Merovingian story cannot be fully understood through conventional records alone. It is a tapestry of intrigue, mysticism, and secrecy, woven in shadows and left intentionally incomplete. Perhaps the most haunting possibility is that the line never truly ended. Hidden heirs, preserved artifacts, and surviving rituals may continue to shape history in ways invisible to most observers. In the quiet corners of Europe, in forgotten monasteries, or the whispered stories of rural communities, traces of the Merovingians linger, a reminder that history is often written not by the victors alone, but by those who know how to remain unseen. The fall of the dynasty, then, is not merely a story of loss. It is a story of concealment, of survival against overwhelming odds, and of mysteries that continue to captivate the imagination centuries later. The remnants of the Merovingians are scattered, often hidden in plain sight, leaving behind tantalizing traces of a dynasty whose secrets defy time. Maps, manuscripts, and relics all hint at a world beyond ordinary history, a reality in which knowledge was preserved in coded forms, carefully guarded by those who understood its value. These artifacts were not merely symbols of power. They were vessels of information, repositories of a legacy that could shape both spiritual understanding and political influence. Every map, every parchment, carries whispers of an intelligence far older and more deliberate than the conventional records suggest. One of the most intriguing elements lies in the maps attributed to Merovingian influence. These are not simple territorial records, but intricate depictions of landscapes interwoven with symbols, sacred sites, and possible hidden markers. Some scholars believe these maps indicate locations of secret sanctuaries, buried treasures, or even hidden lineages. When read through the lens of esoteric interpretation, rivers, forests, and mountain ranges are not mere geography. They are coded instructions, perhaps guiding initiates toward knowledge that was deliberately concealed from the public. The idea that maps could encode such secrets suggests a sophistication in the Merovingian approach to information preservation that challenges the conventional understanding of early medieval Europe. Manuscripts offer another window into their hidden world. Many surviving texts are fragmentary, obscured in monasteries or tucked away in the margins of larger works, often overlooked by historians focused on political events or religious doctrine. Within these faded pages lie cryptic notations, obscure genealogical charts, and references to ceremonies, rituals, and sacred objects. Some manuscripts even hint at connections between the Merovingians and other ancient traditions, including links to biblical lineages, Celtic practices, and possibly even Mediterranean mystery schools. The deliberate obfuscation in the texts, coded language, allegorical storytelling, and symbolic illustrations suggests an intent to shield knowledge from uninitiated eyes while ensuring its transmission across generations. Artifacts themselves carry a mystique that transcends their physical form. Chalices, ceremonial rings, swords, and even crowns are believed to have been more than tools of statecraft. They were instruments imbued with symbolic and possibly spiritual significance. A ceremonial sword, for example, may have been crafted to align with celestial events or inscribed with markings that encode specific instructions or protective formulas. Chalices and reliquaries may have served as conduits, linking the earthly and the divine, the ruler and the sacred, preserving the memory of rituals that were essential to the dynasty's esoteric framework. The reverence and secrecy surrounding these objects suggest that their true function was understood by only a select few, initiates trained to maintain and interpret their power. Some of the most fascinating traces are found in architecture and landscape design. Certain churches, abbeys, and palaces bear subtle geometrical patterns or unusual orientations that appear deliberate, perhaps aligning with solstices, equinoxes, or other celestial phenomena. Scholars who study archaeoastronomy and sacred geometry suggest that these sites functioned as more than places of worship. They were stages for rituals, focal points for energy, or markers pointing to hidden knowledge. Even the positioning of relics within these structures may encode messages or instructions for initiates, a silent communication preserved for centuries. In this way, the physical world becomes a map, a manuscript, and a code, all intertwined in the Merovingians' legacy. The survival of these artifacts and manuscripts is remarkable considering the sweeping changes brought by the Carolingians and later dynasties. Many items were confiscated, hidden, or repurposed to erase traces of Merovingian influence. In some cases, objects were secretly protected by loyal families, secret societies, or monastic communities, ensuring that fragments of knowledge endured even as the dynasty itself disappeared from the political stage. These hidden treasures have fueled centuries of speculation, inspiring treasure hunters, scholars, and conspiracy theorists alike. Even today, rare manuscripts and objects occasionally resurface, their authenticity debated, their secrets largely undeciphered, teasing us with the possibility that the story is far from complete. There are tantalizing hints that some artifacts may have been moved across Europe or even beyond to preserve the lineage's secrets. Relics associated with the bloodline, maps pointing to sacred sites, and manuscripts containing coded genealogies may have been dispersed to protect them from those who sought to erase the Merovingians entirely. Certain legends suggest that some items found their way to powerful families, religious orders, or even secretive societies, who became guardians of this hidden knowledge. The journey of these artifacts, often obscure and difficult to trace, adds another layer to the mystery, hinting at a deliberate network of preservation that extends beyond national borders and political upheaval. Even the symbolic language present in these artifacts carries its own enigma. Illustrations, motifs, and decorative elements appear repeatedly across manuscripts, seals, and jewelry, often reflecting celestial events, mystical numerology, or coded genealogical references. These symbols suggest a deliberate system of encoding information, designed to communicate with those who understood the language while remaining indecipherable to outsiders. The recurrence of certain motifs, the long-haired king, specific animals, sacred geometrical shapes, may have served as both protective wards and guides, ensuring continuity of knowledge even in the absence of the dynasty's direct rule. Taken together, the maps, manuscripts, and artifacts form a fragmented yet compelling portrait of the Merovingians as a dynasty deeply invested in the preservation of knowledge. They were not merely rulers, but custodians of secrets, aware that their authority extended beyond temporal power and into the realm of the mystical. The objects they left behind, scattered and hidden, are silent witnesses to a civilization that understood the value of coded wisdom, of secrecy, and of legacy. Each discovery, whether a faded manuscript, a cryptic map, or a ceremonial chalice, serves as a thread connecting modern researchers to a past that remains stubbornly elusive, a puzzle that continues to captivate and confound. In exploring these artifacts, we begin to grasp the full scope of the Merovingians' sophistication. Their knowledge was multi-layered, expressed through objects, symbols, and geography, preserved through secrecy and careful planning. The line between legend and history blurs here, leaving us with more questions than answers. What else might have survived undetected, and how much of Europe's hidden history remains encoded in these remnants of a vanished dynasty? In the silence of these objects, the Merovingians speak to us still, a whisper of a civilization that mastered both power and secrecy, leaving behind traces that continue to challenge our understanding of history. As the fragments of history, legend, and secret knowledge converge, the true magnitude of the Merovingian story begins to emerge. It is here, at this crossroads of fact and myth, that we can attempt to connect the dots, piecing together a narrative that spans centuries, survives political upheavals, and whispers across the margins of manuscripts, maps, and ceremonial relics. The fall of the Merovingians was not simply a matter of politics or dynastic weakness. It was the extinguishing of a visible authority while something deeper, subtler, and profoundly secret endured. The dynasty's twilight was, paradoxically, a prelude to a form of hidden immortality. Political forces alone cannot explain the precision with which the Merovingians disappeared from history. Carolingians, ascendant and ambitious, may have eliminated rival claimants and rewritten legal frameworks to legitimize their rule, yet the pattern of disappearance suggests a broader, almost surgical intervention. Certain Merovingian kings vanished from chronicles. Heirs who should have assumed power were quietly obscured. Records were rewritten to erase connections to sacred bloodlines. The deliberate nature of this erasure implies more than mere opportunism. It implies knowledge of the dynasty's significance beyond the visible plane. Whoever orchestrated this decline understood the potency of the Merovingians' influence, not merely as rulers, but as custodians of a hidden, sacred authority. Central to this narrative is the idea of bloodline continuity. Scholars and esoteric theorists propose that heirs of the Merovingian line were not extinguished but protected, sequestered in remote locations, or integrated into other noble families. These hidden descendants, whether in monasteries, secluded estates, or foreign courts, would have preserved both the genetic legacy and the esoteric traditions of the dynasty. Over centuries, their influence could ripple subtly through European history, shaping alliances, marriages, and even the transfer of wealth and authority, all while remaining invisible to mainstream records. The concept of a secret lineage transforms the fall from a narrative of loss into a story of strategic concealment and survival. A dynasty whose visible reign ended, but whose hidden power endured. Esoteric knowledge, ritual practice, and sacred objects converge in this hidden network. The Merovingians' rituals, once performed in forests, sanctuaries, and crypts, may have contained the keys to both spiritual and temporal authority. Sacred chalices, inscribed relics, and ceremonial garments were not merely symbols. They were tools to preserve and transmit encoded wisdom. Their dispersion across Europe, often hidden or protected by secret societies, suggests a deliberate plan to safeguard knowledge that could challenge or destabilize any succeeding powers. The Templars and later Rosicrucian and Masonic traditions are often theorized as intermediaries in this preservation, safeguarding manuscripts, relics, and genealogical secrets. These societies may have functioned as invisible custodians, ensuring that the essence of the Merovingians' authority survived, even as the dynasty itself vanished from public record. The convergence of legend and historical accounts strengthens the sense of a hidden continuum. Consider the recurring motif of the long-haired king. This symbol, recorded in chronicles, depicted in seals, and echoed in esoteric manuscripts, was not simply a visual marker of nobility. It was a sign of sacred authority, a visible manifestation of the dynasty's mystical essence. The ceremonial significance of hair in coronations, rites of passage, and other esoteric practices underscores the intertwining of physical and symbolic power. Even as political authority was stripped, the symbols endured, signaling that the Merovingians' presence remained, albeit hidden, encoded in objects, rituals, and stories passed down in secrecy. Relics and manuscripts are central to understanding the dynasty's hidden influence. Some documents, carefully preserved in monastic libraries or private collections, contain cryptic genealogies, ritual instructions, or maps pointing to sacred sites. Others are written in coded language, allegorical stories, or symbolic illustrations, intended to be deciphered only by those initiated into the mysteries. Maps, for instance, often include not only territorial information, but celestial alignments, markers for hidden sanctuaries, or encoded instructions to locate treasures or sacred objects. These surviving fragments suggest a continuity of purpose, knowledge that was meant to be preserved, decoded, and applied, even after the fall of the visible dynasty. The Grail legend further intertwines with the Merovingian legacy, suggesting a symbolic rather than purely physical continuity. If the Grail represents the sacred bloodline itself, its divine essence, wisdom, and authority, then the quest for the Grail becomes a metaphor for the preservation of this hidden power. Across centuries, myths of hidden chalices, secret lineages, and sacred relics may have encoded knowledge of the dynasty's survival. To those who understood the symbolism, these were not mere fairy tales but instructions, warnings, and maps for safeguarding what was considered sacred. In this way, the fall of the dynasty becomes part of a larger, ongoing narrative, a deliberate withdrawal into secrecy, designed to protect and transmit knowledge across generations. Even modern conspiracy theories find echoes in this hidden continuity. Some claim that members of European nobility, unknowingly or otherwise, carry fragments of Merovingian blood. Certain secret societies may continue to preserve rituals, symbols, and knowledge tied to the dynasty, influencing events subtly and silently. Popular literature, films, and speculative research continue to explore these ideas, reflecting the enduring fascination with a dynasty whose story is at once historical and mythic, visible and invisible, political and mystical. The continuing intrigue suggests that the Merovingians' hidden power may be felt long after their political structures were dismantled. The implications of this hidden survival are staggering. It suggests a world where authority, knowledge, and influence can persist outside the bounds of recorded history, where dynasties vanish from chronicles yet endure in symbolic, genetic, and esoteric forms. It challenges conventional historical narratives, forcing us to consider that what we know as history is only a fraction of what once existed. The Merovingians, in this light, were more than kings and queens. They were stewards of a hidden legacy, architects of a continuity that outlived their visible reign. By piecing together the fragments, chronicles, relics, manuscripts, symbols, and oral traditions, we begin to glimpse a fuller picture. The dynasty's fall was not an absolute ending, but a transition from overt to covert influence. The Merovingians' power, encoded in sacred objects, rituals, and hidden heirs, may have quietly shaped European history in ways that defy documentation. Their Twilight becomes a study in strategy, secrecy, and endurance, a lesson in how influence can persist when knowledge is preserved carefully, deliberately, and beyond the eyes of ordinary observers. The climactic realization is both haunting and mesmerizing. The Merovingians were never entirely gone. Their authority, though hidden, persisted in relics, in the coded knowledge of manuscripts, in secretive bloodlines, and in the rituals that survived across centuries. The dynasty's story is not merely one of political decline, but a testament to the enduring power of secrecy, symbolism, and strategy. The fall of the visible line conceals a far more profound survival, a hidden reign that stretches across time, continuing to influence, inspire, and provoke curiosity to this very day. The dynasty's story challenges us to reconsider what history truly represents. It asks us to see beyond kings and chronicles, to read between the lines of symbols, artifacts, and legends. The fall of the Merovingians was not an ending, but a transformation, a migration from the public sphere into the shadows where power is preserved not by armies or crowns, but by knowledge, secrecy, and continuity. It is in these shadows that the Merovingians remain alive, whispering across centuries, inviting those willing to seek them out to decode the mysteries they left behind. The Twilight of the Merovingians is not merely the story of a dynasty's end. It is the story of a transformation, a quiet passage from visible sovereignty to enduring influence hidden beneath layers of secrecy, symbolism, and legend. As the Carolingians rose to prominence, the Merovingians receded from the public eye, but their disappearance was far from complete. In the shadows, their legacy persisted, encoded in sacred objects, cryptic manuscripts, and bloodlines carefully preserved through centuries. The dynasty's twilight is a testament to the delicate interplay between visibility and concealment, between political authority and esoteric power, a lesson in how a lineage can endure even when it seems lost to history. At the heart of this enduring influence is the concept of sacred blood. Unlike ordinary dynasties whose power rested solely on military might or political alliances, the Merovingians were believed to carry a divine essence. Their long hair, untouched from birth, was more than a ceremonial adornment. It was a symbol of spiritual authority, a living conduit of power. This sacred quality made their disappearance from the historical record even more remarkable. It was not simply a political eclipse. It was a withdrawal of a line imbued with mystical significance. The preservation of this bloodline, whether through secret heirs, hidden marriages, or integration into other noble families, ensured that the essence of the dynasty continued, quietly shaping history from behind the scenes. Artifacts and relics played a central role in sustaining the dynasty's hidden presence. Chalices, swords, ceremonial rings, and regalia were carefully guarded, each item imbued with symbolic and possibly mystical power. These objects served as repositories of knowledge, encoded with genealogical information, ritual instructions, and warnings intended for the initiated. Over time, they became central to networks of secrecy, preserved by loyal families, monastic communities, or esoteric societies who understood their importance. The careful protection of these relics ensured that, even in the absence of visible kings and queens, the Merovingians' legacy endured in tangible form, a silent but potent reminder of their enduring influence. Manuscripts, often obscure and coded, further amplified the dynasty's hidden presence. Marginal notes, allegorical stories, and symbolic illustrations preserve knowledge of sacred rituals, genealogical lines, and mystical practices. Some manuscripts contain maps with cryptic markings, pointing to sanctuaries, hidden treasures, or ceremonial sites. Others encoded prophecies or teachings intended to guide future generations of initiates. These texts, scattered across Europe, functioned as vessels for continuity, ensuring that the dynasty's influence was not confined to its temporal reign. Even today, fragments of these manuscripts tantalize historians and enthusiasts, hinting at truths deliberately concealed from mainstream understanding. The symbolic language of the Merovingians extended beyond objects and texts into the very landscape of Europe. Churches, abbeys, and sacred sites retain alignments, geometric patterns, and architectural features that suggest deliberate planning, perhaps intended to preserve the dynasty's esoteric knowledge. Celestial alignments, solstice and equinox orientations, and hidden chambers may have served as focal points for rituals or as markers for those seeking to follow the hidden paths of the dynasty. Oral traditions in remote regions, preserved over centuries, recall long-haired kings, sacred relics, and secret ceremonies, suggesting that memory of the dynasty's influence was never entirely lost. The landscape itself became a living archive, a repository of encoded history waiting to be deciphered. Legends of the Holy Grail intertwine with the Merovingians' twilight, offering a symbolic framework for understanding their hidden legacy. In many esoteric interpretations, the Grail is not merely a physical object, but a metaphor for the dynasty itself, the sacred bloodline, the repository of divine knowledge, and the key to spiritual authority. Myths surrounding the Grail, hidden chalices, secret heirs, and protective rituals may reflect the dynasty's deliberate concealment, encoding knowledge and power in symbolic form. The search for the Grail thus becomes a journey through layers of history, myth, and secrecy, mirroring the enduring quest to uncover the hidden influence of the Merovingians. Even in modern times, the echoes of the dynasty's twilight are felt. Conspiracy theories, historical reinterpretations, and popular culture continue to explore the possibility that Merovingian bloodlines and knowledge persist in subtle, hidden ways. Secret societies, symbols, and rituals interpreted as Merovingian in origin suggest that the dynasty's influence may continue to shape ideas, alliances, and cultural narratives in ways that remain largely invisible. The fascination with the Merovingians is not merely nostalgia. It reflects a recognition of a lineage that mastered the art of enduring power through secrecy and symbolism. The twilight of the Merovingians also raises profound questions about the nature of history itself. How much of what we accept as recorded history is only the visible surface, while deeper currents of influence flow unseen? The dynasty's story challenges conventional narratives, showing that power can survive outside the public eye, encoded in symbols, preserved in relics, and carried forward in hidden bloodlines. It reminds us that disappearance does not necessarily equate to extinction, that influence can persist in forms that evade documentation, and that the most enduring legacies are often the ones that history tries hardest to forget. Symbolically, the twilight represents a shift from temporal to eternal influence. The Merovingians' visible reign may have ended, but their hidden authority, through sacred blood, secret knowledge, and encoded rituals, persisted, shaping Europe's spiritual, cultural, and even political landscapes. This transition from overt power to covert influence is a lesson in resilience and strategy, illustrating how a dynasty can transcend the limits of ordinary history. The Merovingians were not merely kings and queens. They were custodians of hidden truths, architects of a continuity that defied time, and masters of secrecy who understood the enduring value of being unseen. In reflecting on their twilight, one sees a dynasty that mastered both visibility and concealment, understanding that true power is not only in the throne, but in knowledge preserved, in symbols interpreted, and in bloodlines protected. Their story challenges us to see beyond the surface of historical events, to explore the layers of secrecy, myth, and hidden influence that often shape the world. Every relic, manuscript, and whispered legend is a thread in the tapestry of their enduring legacy, each one reminding us that the Merovingians' story continues, quietly and invisibly, across the centuries. Ultimately, the twilight of the Merovingians is a meditation on endurance, secrecy, and the nature of influence. Their disappearance from the political stage does not mark an end, but rather a transformation, a passage from visible kingship to enduring hidden power. It is a reminder that history is never complete, that some stories are preserved not in chronicles, but in shadows, symbols, and the careful guarding of knowledge. The Merovingians, though absent from the pages of official history, remain present in the echoes of sacred bloodlines, in artifacts and manuscripts, and the very landscapes that once witnessed their rituals. Their twilight is not a conclusion. It is an invitation to look closer, to question, and to seek the hidden currents that continue to shape the world long after the fall of a dynasty.